Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Heather Ferrell. I'm the curator and director of exhibitions at Burlington City Arts, and we are thrilled that you are all starting to join us for our artist talk with Meg Lipke. It will take a few minutes for everyone to kind of log on, so we'll be patient and wait. And meanwhile, Meg, I'd love to check in and see how your day's going so far.
Hi, Heather. It's really nice to be here. It's a beautiful day here. Sun is shining and there's birds singing in the trees. So it really feels like spring.
Oh, wonderful. I know. It's about that time, isn't it?
Yeah.
And where are we finding you right now? Because I see some amazing paintings in the background.
This is my living room. I have some things up on the wall that I'm still kind of looking at to figure out if they're finished or if I like them. And the studio is out that way in a different building. And I'll be going there later today after our talk.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. I know. So, and we were just talking about hopefully seeing you soon in person at the gallery once all the vaccinations are finished and these crazy COVID times where the artist has to kind of wait until they can see their own exhibition in person.
I know it was so crazy installing the way we did over FaceTime, and that I've never had that experience before where I haven't been able to be there. And there were some obvious pluses because I didn't have to help lift those huge, heavy pieces. So thank you.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe it's Slanting Grid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you guys did an amazing job. I can't believe it. And I'm so much looking forward to coming and I should be able to come by late April. I will be vaccinated.
Oh, that would be amazing. I know there's so many of us artists, curators, and the public who are just like these crazy times, and I have to say this is the first time I've ever had to so fully curate an exhibition online or through FaceTime and sharing files. And you've been tremendous, Meg. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hopefully we all have sort of more brain cells from having to do all of these new things on the computer.
Yes, exactly. Well, I can already see we have a wonderful group that's joined us. So I think I'm going to go ahead and begin our program today. And for those joining late, I'd like to welcome you all, or I should say, just in the last few minutes. I'm Heather Ferrell. I'm the curator and director of exhibitions at Burlington City Arts, here with Meg Lipke, and who is a fabulous artist whose solo exhibition is currently on view at the BCA Center. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Meg's work, she really challenges conventional notions of painting with her colorful shaped abstractions. They're cut, they're stained, painted, and sewn together. And she creates work, paintings that project from the wall. They rest on the floor. They're monumental. And we are really pleased to be able to feature approximately 5 years of work so that we can show you her innovative process and her evolution as a painter. And we have works from her small collage layer painting to, as I mentioned, the monumental Slanting Grid at 18 feet wide that she created especially for our show. Before we begin today, I'd like to share just a few notes on our program. And after my introductions, Meg will give a presentation on the evolution of her painting practice, especially over these past few years. And we'll see a lot of the works drawn from the exhibition. And following her talk, we will open up the program to questions from you, our audience. So please use your Zoom Q&A feature to pose your questions for Meg, and we will answer all of these at the end of the presentation. You're also welcome to chat and use that feature as well. And a reminder that today's webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our BCA Home Studio site. So now for a brief bio here. It's been a pleasure working with you, Meg, these past few months in curating your show In the Making. Meg's creative practice and really intrepid commitment to pushing the boundaries of painting is inspiring to anyone who enters the BCA Center. We are thrilled to present Meg's first solo exhibition in Vermont in over a decade. And Meg is a remarkable artist whose familial and artistic development is really deeply rooted in Burlington and Vermont, where she was raised, she attended school, and later earned her BA at the University of Vermont. Meg has been exhibiting her work since, the early 90s. And she's been featured in solo shows at the Jeff Bailey Gallery in Hudson, New York, Freight and Volume in New York, and most recently with the Broadway Gallery, which also represents her. And that was this past fall. And then in 2019, she was really able to do a collaborative performance between the choreographer Julia Gleich of Gleich Dance as at the University of Buffalo Art Galleries in New York. And I believe that was Unus Monday, but I might not be pronouncing it right.
Yes.
Great. Meg's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and has been reviewed in Art in America, The Village Voice, New York Times, The New Yorker, GQ, and Art Forum, and many online publications. And Meg's work is also found in private collections from Los Angeles to New York City, Kansas City to Paris and London. Meg, you received your BA at the University of Vermont and your MFA from Cornell University. And as I mentioned earlier, she is represented by Broadway in New York. And with that, thank you for joining us today, Meg. And I'd like to turn the time over to you.
Yay, thank you so much. Okay, well, I would like to say thank you to Heather and to Colin and the staff at BCA, as well as to the donors who made this show possible, Stephanie Spencer and Rolf Kielman, and an anonymous donor. And I'd also like to thank Margot Norton from the New Museum and Chelsea Spengeman for contributing essays to the catalog for the show, which is about to be available. So I'm going to take you through, as Heather said, approximately 5 to 6 years of my painting practice. And these two slides will kind of show where I was in about 2015. And here's a detail on the right of the piece, which is at the BCA Center right now, made in 2020 for this show. I also want to say, to acknowledge that growing up in Burlington really gave me an incredible amount of privileged exposure to art making. As many of you know who are there at home, my mother is an artist and taught art history, Catherine Hall, and my father, Bill Lipke, who just passed away last year, was an art historian at UVM. So I grew up in an academic setting, and the art community in Burlington in the 70s and 80s and 90s really was very inspiring. I had great art teachers from high school all the way through UVM, people who really encouraged me to follow the path that I sort of identified by the time I was about 15. So I just really feel incredibly privileged that I never had to really be defensive about my choice to be an artist. It was really something that has always been super supported in my family and my community. After I went to Cornell for graduate school, I was a fairly traditional painter. I made oil paintings on stretchers, and I did that for about 10 to 12 years. I don't have any slides to show you, but I do have this review that has a small kind of thumbnail of a painting that was in a show at 55 Mercer Gallery. And I had a wonderful run of making oil paintings. They were abstract. I felt like they were sort of personally narrative. I kind of mined this personal experience that I had living as a young person, especially as a young woman. I was teaching in Iowa, and I had a lot of shows and some really nice reviews during that time. But I kind of hit a wall in my painting practice and didn't really know how to make painting exciting. I had a year where I really felt kind of down about painting. And it was at that time that I thought quite a lot about craft. When I went to graduate school, craft was still seen as something that was really below fine art. And it took seeing an exhibition of the quilters of Gee's Bend, and also seeing what Glenn Adamson was doing at the Museum of Art and Design, to really understand that I felt like craft had this kind of emotional immediacy that painting no longer had for me, not just in the making, but also in looking at painting. I kind of felt like I was exhausted by looking at it and by making it. And so I tried to make a lot of work on paper while I figured out what I was going to do. And I also looked back at my own life and personal history to the work of my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived in England, and who made a lot of tapestries, weavings, and embroideries with the surplus yarns from the family mill, which had gone under, and all of the yarns had been brought to her house in England, where the business was still being run. So here there's a sample card on the left-hand side of the business, William Hall and Co. And then these three pieces that she made are embroidery on burlap with various cotton yarns and gold floss. And you can see that she is looking at, I'm guessing, the work of Matisse, this kind of personal symbology that she's using. You can see that there are some recognizable symbols like birds, spirals, possibly a peace sign in a square box, and also a shape that I have found really significant to me in the image all the way on the right, which looks to me like a ghost-like shape. I'm using my cursor right now to identify that shape. And I also was looking at the work of my mother, Catherine Hall. And although she has done so many different bodies of work in performance and sculpture and painting, I was really particularly drawn to a body of work that she made, which is a textile-based body of work. She was dipping Japanese paper into dye and beeswax. You can see the beeswax is slightly glistening at the paper's edge. And I remember her making these when I was a teenager, and her studio was in the attic. And I found these incredibly beautiful, and I still find them very moving because of their materiality, because of their color, and because they are on the wall, and yet they're not really painting and they're not really sculpture. They're this kind of other thing that also evokes craft, but you see on the wall where you're used to seeing painting and drawing. So after really thinking about these two women in my history, I took the idea of painting with beeswax and dye into my studio. And I switched over from working on canvas to working with a very thin muslin, still cotton, but with a thinner weave that's not so pronounced and which accepts the melted beeswax and the dye in a much stronger way. It's much more absorbent, and so you get cleaner lines. This is a piece that's in the show at BCA, and it's about 50 inches long by 36 inches wide. And I painted it on the floor with the beeswax and the dye, and it's sort of a map-like space. But you also notice that there is a kind of geometry, especially around these shapes that are in the middle, that is evocative of the sample card that I showed in the image with my grandmother's embroideries. I was also in the studio making a lot of small kind of, I called them samples, ideas that I was generating on different materials while I thought about how I was going to expand this idea of painting. So I'm working here on cardboard and very thick watercolor paper, on felt. I have tape in the mix here, some knitting, some collage, and felt. So, oh, and here is an actual sample card that I've kind of put into the mix, and I arranged these all on the wall to kind of evoke my fantasy of what the mill might have been like that my grandfather had. I had never seen it. I had just heard about it in stories. So these are supposed to be like smokestacks from a factory. And I also began cutting through different layers of material and then rewrapping them around a traditional support. This piece is also from the show, and it's called Layered Painting. And it's small, it's 8 by 10 inches. But I was interested in this idea about what might happen if you saw one pattern through another pattern, as if it were like a window cut through to something else. From here, I started really playing with this idea of cutting things out. And this is an image to show you how I was painting on the floor with the wax and the dye, and then cutting out the sections that I was most engaged by, and figuring out a different way to show them. It occurred to me that the stretcher is really kind of burdened with being part of the history of painting. And I know for all the painters out there, you will understand when I say that sometimes I find the history of painting really overwhelming. It's such I'm talking about the history of Western painting, which is what I was educated in. You know, the history of studying all of these different grounds that painters work with and pigments that you can make or you can buy, and varying thickness and thinness of different pigments and drying times and all these things. Specifically to me, the stretcher bar and the rigidity of the stretcher bar was something I really wanted to do away with. And so when I cut out this figure from the greater painting, I thought that I would create a soft support for it to be wrapped around. And here in this piece, you can see this side of the painting is actually created, sewn to the front of the painting in the same dimension as a stretcher bar. It's 2 inches. but it's on a soft cushion, a soft piece of foam. And I thought this was so funny, this idea of cutting something out and turning it into a pillow, basically, like a flat kind of cushion on the wall. It made me think about how our bodies respond to something soft versus a painting which is on a rigid support. Suddenly, these kind of ideas about sitting on these paintings, even though they were on the wall, kind of came into play. Ideas about upholstery or bedding or textiles that we put on our body or we're in relationship with our bodies. And these weren't, you might look at something like this and think of Elizabeth Murray. You might still think that they're rigid, but when you get up close, you can see that the edge is soft. So both of these paintings, Orange Bits, the previous one, and this one, Black Cloud, are in the BCA show. I made a year or two's worth of work making these flat paintings, and I explored all these different shapes. They were complicated to sew, and I had a show of them at the Jeff Bailey Gallery, along with these ready-made forms that I found that were hat molds. And here they are displayed on the desk with some of the flat paintings, the cushion paintings on the wall behind. I was interested in that point, though, into moving into a more volumetric arena. I was thinking about how kind of slick those flat paintings were and how they felt slightly removed from my body. And I realized that I could sew these tubes and stuff them with loose stuffing rather than foam, and that they would automatically create a volume which was evocative of a limb, an arm or a leg. On the left, this blue knitted piece is actually a knitted blanket of my grandmother's that I painted and sewed together and stuffed. And then there's a blue stocking next to that, which is painted on and bound. And then the other forms are various materials painted with beeswax. And I'm sort of playing and experimenting here. Around this time, I also began using any sorts of materials I could get. I was, at this point, had a studio outside the home, but because my husband and I have 3 children, many times I was inside the home bringing my work with me. And this piece is the first real piece in the kind of vein that I still consider myself to be in. And I made it from the children's winter puffy jackets. I had found some of their jackets were very stained and had holes in them, and I cut them at the shoulder, pulled the lining out, and then sewed both of those long tubes together to create this hoop. And it is simultaneously an embrace, an artist's embrace of her children, thinking about keeping your children safe by joining the arms. It's like a hug, but it's also a frame and framing the negative space that's in the center, and therefore working within the language of painting again, where you're thinking about positive and negative space and the push and the pull, and the idea of painting as a window taking you somewhere else. And so I was so excited about this piece, and it led me to many others, including this piece, Parallel Bones, which is also made from a winter jacket, a white winter jacket that had a gray lining. And this piece also kind of was informed by our children, because at this point, our daughter, Francesca, who was 5, broke her elbow. And we took her to the Bone and Joint Center, and she had many x-rays, and she had 2 different casts put on. And here I made these 2 thinner tubes and stuffed them. And those are the kind of parallel bones that cross this frame. But I'm also using plaster gauze, the same kind of gauze that you use in a cast. And that joins the area where the cufflinks were in the coat. So there's this kind of connection to her body, the idea of the body in general, the idea of protection, and also the idea of painting. For me, also, these parallel bones also evoke a horizon line. So I'm thinking about both the history of painting and the body and these kind of narrative issues that are just bleeding into my life as an artist. This piece is called Support. And I made those 2 holes because suddenly getting Francesca's arm, her arm with the cast on it, into her armholes was impossible. And this happened in the winter, and we had to think about how she was going to, be warm as we sent her off to school. The bottom half of this small piece, which is also at BCA, is covered in the plaster. And you can see here on the surface, in this piece, I'm also still painting with the beeswax. And sometimes I'm leaving it on, and the surface is kind of, it's kind of degraded. It's kind of scuffled up, or looks as if it's had a history. And so there's something, that's happening where I'm alluding to textile design and patterning, but also to this kind of history of the painted object. And from this place, I really am still exploring the idea of the frame and the window. This piece is also at BCA. It's about 14 inches square. And there are 2 main kind of negative spaces. So it's not a straight up frame here. It's a little bit more complicated. And the negative spaces are really there to kind of frame the nothingness of the wall. The viewer gets to sort of decide if it is truly the wall which is important, or if they can project their own kind of fantasy about what the work is about. And the outside of the frame is stained very simply with diluted dye. For me, as the artist, there's this kind of contradiction that I like between making the frame very active and the subject, and also making this negative space the subject. This is a newer work from 2020. So about 4 years in between these 2 pieces, but you can see it's still something that I'm very much investigating. This is called Rainbow Hanger, and it is about twice the size of the previous image. And I'm still using this very diluted dye and wax on the surface. And the wax on the surface is really on the bottom and the right-hand side of the image. So going back now to 2015, 16, I was investigating all of these different ways that I could think about openings. I could think about, the grid. This is like a soft vertical grid made out of wool from a coat. This is a piece that I made that has cutouts that relate to a small piece of cardboard packaging that I had kept and painted on. It was this piece right here, when folded back up, becomes a small box to showcase an Easter egg. And I picked it up in the Polish neighborhood of Brooklyn, where I used to live, and was really taken by the relationship of the packaging to the sample card that the yarns had been wrapped around in my grandfather's woolen mill. And this is really to show you how many of the forms that I wind up with do not arise out of nowhere or just simply out of my head. There's actually quite a lot of work that goes into figuring out if a piece is going to be a full-blown stuffed work or not. So here's this tiny little, maybe 3 by 6 inch cardboard piece. And then here's a 5 by 6 foot painting on paper. And on the right, this is a piece made with cloth that I decided not to stuff. And then if I go back, you can see this is the actual final result. And this piece you can see at the BCA. On the surface of this piece, over these patterned, very minimal lines, you'll see these round pieces of felt. And this is actually where I'm covering up the scars that are left after I've cut open the canvas and stuffed it with the polyester filling. So here I'm sort of making this like a decorative element, these felt circles. And here's another example of a piece at BCA and the kind of background studies that went into it. This piece on the left is called Slump, and it has the possibility of being exhibited like this in this photograph, or sitting on the ground, which is how it is currently at the BCA Center. First, it was a cardboard study, and then it was a painting on the right. And you can see they're not exact. They're sort of, investigations of forms that are similar. When I made this piece, Slump, I was really thinking about the kind of the body being exhausted. I created this piece by sewing different channels in a great big piece of canvas, so that rather than being one volumetric frame, it's many different kind of channels that are stuffed, that are almost like fingers when you're looking at your hand with your fingers together. And I liked how this piece evoked the body in terms of wrinkles, in terms of the scars, where I had stuffed the piece, the folds, and also the posture. The way that this piece settles on the floor is very different from the way it is when it's hung on the wall. And to me, there was something comical and also slightly tragic about the idea of a painting being hung on the wall and then sort of falling down in exhaustion, as if it's exhausted by its role of being a painting. The piece on the right is a piece which is similar, which was shown at Freight and Volume in 2018. It was even bigger than Slump, and the kind of part of the piece which is resting on the floor was so huge that visitors were really tempted to sit on it. In fact, some people, while I was there, asked if they could come in and hug it, which really gave me pause, because I thought for a minute, well, why not? But I was also afraid that the piece might not withstand that kind of touch. In addition to thinking about the body in terms of the way we respond to the pieces on the wall, and the way that the pieces themselves have body because they are stuffed, I have made freestanding sculptures. And there are 2 in the BCA show. this is icon 1 and icon 2. And they are solitary figures that relate immediately to the viewer because they are slightly taller than the average viewer. And because, once we see sculpture, there's this confrontation that we have with the body of the sculpture and our bodies. And of course, we can walk all the way around a sculpture. It's not usually on a wall. With these, I was investigating different materials. There's muslin, canvas, there's stuffing, there's rope you can see in the piece on the right-hand side, and netting. But ultimately, I found that I was more interested in this site of the wall. I want to talk again about influences. Other than looking at the work of my mother and my grandmother, I was thinking a lot about this particular work by Ava Hess with Sol LeWitt, who helped fabricate it. It's called Hang Up, of course. It's a seminal piece by her, and I had the luck to see it when I was teaching in Iowa. It was in a traveling show. And I was really struck by how the piece speaks to my hang-ups about paintings, about painting, the practice of painting. I loved the fact that the hanging mechanism really projected into the space of the viewer and onto the floor in a very aggressive manner. And yet it also framed the wall space. It is wrapped in cloth around the outside edge. And I really was so kind of taken with this idea of something being on the wall and being a painting, but also being very confrontational and aggressive. And so I scaled my pieces up and started thinking about other ways that I could kind of depict this this opening being scaled up. This piece is called Dream of a Painting, and it's in the BCA show. It's one of my favorite pieces. I was thinking about patterning on the outside when I was painting it and looking back to that kind of glyph-like, shape-like symbology that my grandmother had used in her embroideries. But also, just really finding ways to move around the outside of the frame so that there's a different kind of color nuance and shape nuance and even speed that you can experience when you're looking at the piece to distract you momentarily from the fact that there's this negative shape on the inside. This space on the inside, the larger empty space, is really big enough for you to start thinking about moving your body through. It's like a portal. And I really enjoyed making that about this piece. And it made me want to explore a kind of architectural relationship between the work and the viewer's body even more. Here's Francesca in front of Target Frame, which is a really gigantic piece. It's about 10 feet tall by 8 feet wide. And it is similar to Dream of a Painting, in which I'm painting this kind of varying language and color around the outside edges. But here in one of the negative spaces, I've made a painting within a painting, and that's a target. And so there's this kind of meta moment where there's the painting, the negative space, and then the painting within a painting. Here is an example of how I make the work. This is my son, Oscar, our son, Oscar, who's my assistant for the moment in this picture. And these big sewn drawings are so large that if I want to work on more than one at a time, if the weather's nice, I can work outside on them and let the dye dry in the sun. This is a close-up of one of the pieces. When I'm working with the dye, I can think about staining in a kind of Helen Frankenthaler, Sam Gilliam kind of way. I can also think about creating more of a body of the paint, more of an impastoed surface if I use textile dye, which is not watered down. Sometimes I add glitter or iridescent paint to the dye, and you can see that here. And my children, in addition to providing the scale in photographs and in helping me move things back and forth, are also sometimes models for ideas. Here is Francesca, and she was actually helping me move some of these pieces to the car, but I couldn't resist taking a photograph because I loved the way that her sleeve relates to one of the pieces that she is holding. And here's Francesca again in front of a piece that was in a Buffalo show called Take 5. This is called Garden Gates. I was thinking about how gates are another way that you can think about positive and negative space and the act of opening and closing. And this is Garden Gates 2. This piece is constructed completely out of a kind of sewn tubing. And this piece was just at the Esther Massery Gallery at the College of St. Rose. Here's a studio shot that shows both of those works in progress. You can see that I am constructing the last piece on the floor, and I have a lot of things going at once when I'm working, including there's a chair under here somewhere. These are sort of lots of small parts that may or may not make it into a larger piece. Here is a recent piece called Blue Eye Frame, where I took the idea of the frame and the idea of the painting within a painting and put this kind of form that was originally from a different artwork and nestled it inside the negative space that's created by the frame. Other ways that I've thought about the relationship of the work to the body are, I have considered this idea of the viewer activating the work or being involved in the work. This is a piece called Ground for Body, and it was a piece conceived of for a show in Denver in which I had multiple pieces which were partially stuffed canvases on the wall. And then I had a variety of appendages which could be taken off the hooks on the wall and attached to the pieces on buttonholes, which were on buttons, which were sewn onto the works. And this piece, Ground for Body, is at BCA. I've also done some collaborations to explore what happens when dancers activate my work and create new spaces and new arrangements of my work with their bodies. Heather had spoken about this collaboration, Unus Mundi, that I did with Julia Gleich and her team of ballet dancers. You can see here that 3 dancers are on point on stage. This was from a performance in Brooklyn. And they are wrapped in these kind of shrouds that I painted and holding these stuffed objects that I made. And this was just so exciting for me to see other ways that I could be thinking about painting and other kind of forms that could be made in collaboration with others. In addition to thinking about the idea of the window kind of offering a space to be framed, to see something outside of ourselves, a window can also be an opportunity to look inside. And I tend to think about these works in relationship to my body, especially some of the smaller works that I can work on inside my house or take with me where I'm going. I make a lot of sketches on my phone and in a sketchbook. And I think about how our bodies hold memory and how certain things that have happened to us in the past, accidents we may have been in, or things that may have happened to us may be retained somewhere in our bodies. And I'm interested in thinking about that myself. So these are just some of my quick phone drawings that show a kind of symmetrical approach to the body. And it is from drawings like this that I made this piece, which is called Mother Body. It's in the show at BCA, and it has this kind of symmetry that relates to the two sides of the body, and then this opening in the center, which really speaks to birth. And here is a very small piece called Dancing Figure. It's on canvas, and it's in the BCA show. And it's painted in this very bright and energetic way with lots of little blocks of color on it. And I also think about this as a figure and in relationship with my body, but in a more sort of sprightly, childlike way. This piece, you know, because it was on the front of the information for this talk. This is called Lavender Aqua. It's another smaller piece. And here I had a lot of fun camouflaging the holes which go back to the wall with a kind of pink paint on top of the black, which evokes the holes. But you know, they are not holes. So I'm playing with this, this kind of like hiding what the form is by distracting you with the painting. I made a lot of pieces this last year that loosely look like the map of the United States because, like everybody, I spent so much time looking at the map in relation to our election, but also in terms of COVID and the spread of COVID. And so there are many pieces that have this kind of overall shape, which is indicative of the United States. Okay, and finally, we get to Slanted Grid, which is the piece that I made for BCA, and which is where my interest still remains. This piece is 18 feet long, and I really wanted to take the opportunity of making a piece for this show to explore this idea of the grid. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've always been, you know, sort of obsessed with the idea of the grid. As a painter, it's something that you learn about as soon as you learn about the Renaissance and the history of linear perspective. This is a Durer etching showing his screen that has a grid in it, and then the corresponding screen that he is drawing the information that he's seeing on the paper. And this is, you know, supposed to really help along with the fixed eye position in terms of how to accurately record what you're seeing. And so not only is it, you know, something that really relates to the history of painting in a representational way, but also it's the history of abstraction. This is an Agnes Martin piece from the 60s. And I have used the grid myself as a painter as a way of organizing space. But it seemed to me that making a stuffed grid would be really funny. It's sort of an insider joke about painting, that it's that it's something which is a rigid support or a rigid form, the grid, very geometric, and yet here in my piece, it's leaning, it's slanted, it's not exact. And it also has these 3 little kind of triangular feet on the bottom, as if it was a cartoon character sort of tiptoeing out of the frame. I very purposefully chose to paint this in a manner which references abstract painting, or sort of both the staining of Frankenthaler and Gilliam, as well as the kind of history of action painting. And in this piece also, there is one kind of window which is not cut out and is a frame within a frame. And so, oh my gosh, that's it. So as I'm thinking about what I'm going to move on to next, I'm really still taken with this idea of the grid and exploring this idea of making these monumental grids in my work. Okay, so that's it for me. I would love to answer questions if you have some questions about the work or my process or my history.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg. And really, every time I hear you speak, I get deeper insights into your thinking and your process, and more sort of evolves from each work. And I know we do have already a couple of questions on our Q&A. So let me start with an anonymous attendee who says, hello, is painting with beeswax and dye occurring both before and after your painting, sewing, stuffing process?
There is not a regular method. Sometimes I paint on the work after it's been stuffed, and sometimes I do it before. However, it's really difficult for a needle to go through beeswax. So usually the drawing is done and 2 pieces of canvas are sewn to each other, but the painting comes at some point after that.
Wonderful. And I believe it's Chellis Baird asks, thank you for this beautiful discussion of your work. And regarding influences, has Harmony Hammond been an influence, possibly in relation to the grid, body, and stuffing?
Yes, that's such a great observation. Yes, Harmony Hammond actually taught a drawing class that I managed to sneak into when I was a teenager. This was at the Vermont Studio Center, where my mother was a resident, and I happened to be visiting her and got to go to Harmony Hammond's class. I also must have seen her slide lecture, although I don't remember it. But later on, when I was starting to make work that was stuffed, somebody mentioned her, and I referenced back and realized she made these kind of stuffed ladder-like forms that were propped against the wall, which I really enjoy a lot.
Wonderful. And Melind Cantor asks, I think a clarification, is the beeswax resist, or is it the decoration itself?
It can be both. When you paint with beeswax, it prevents the dye or the paint from sticking, and then you can choose to iron it off so that you have a very slick kind of resist stencil. You can also choose to leave it on as a kind of body, which is not paint, as a substance, which is not paint. So it can be either.
Great. And I think you also have a personal message from Kristen Palazzo, who says, thank you so much. It's wonderful to learn more about your work. And I'm sorry I have to do school pickup. It's that time. And more questions coming in. I'm trying to go through them all. Emily Wadhams asks, or says, your work is wonderful. And you mentioned continuing the grid idea. do you have any specific ideas for the next iteration of your work? Because that was a question I was going to ask you, is what are you working on now?
Yes. Well, I am doing a show at NADA in April. So there will be new work going into that show. And I'm currently making 3 really large pieces that are further investigations of the grid. So there are, sort of 3 kind of continuing looks at what happens if I stuff something which is super geometric. But it's totally in the works, and I can't show any pictures because things may radically change.
But people can follow you on Instagram, which I find is the best way to see how it evolves.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
And I have to ask you, when you were doing Slanted Grid for BCA, I mean, is that how you envisioned it? Or did you get somewhere through the process and went, oh, it went this direction?
No, I really, really thought, I actually have my sketchbook here, and I literally made a drawing. Here it is. I made a drawing and
Wow.
followed it pretty precisely. You know, I'm so familiar with BCA because I've always wanted to show there, and seen so many amazing shows there. So I had an idea about how long the walls were, and I knew that it would need to be more horizontal than vertical. So that was kind of what I came up with. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're very fortunate to have you, Meg. We have questions still coming in, so if you'll be patient with us, everyone has so many great questions. Ruth Root asks, are the newer works stuffed in the back and then patched with felt on the back, or are there patches? I think it's hard for her to imagine how you are stuffing these particular works, and it probably changes over time, right?
Okay, it changes over time. In general, the 2 pieces of canvas are sewn together, and then unless I really want to make a statement about the front of the work having scars, in general, I open up the back with a pair of scissors or whatever and stuff that way. And it's a very physical process. And it takes a long time, and it's a very kind of strange relationship that I have with the work, because it's like I am giving the work volume in this kind of, aggressive way with my body. You can't sort of delicately do it. And if the pieces are complicated or very thin, then I have to use a variety of tools to get the stuffing in there. The only piece that has the patches on the front is the piece that I showed, which is the very minimal piece with the, the circular wool patches. Otherwise, it has, I've chosen to sort of keep those like wounds where I've opened them up hidden from view. I should say I didn't mention, but I had this experience as a very young teenager where my appendix burst, and I wound up in a hospital in England with my mother and my brother. And there was something about that experience, and they weren't able to stitch me up because there was so much poison. So there's something very much about this process of cutting and stuffing and then sewing it's important somehow in my experience. I think I'm still processing all that stuff.
Yeah, it's like a very visceral connection.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too is when you talk about the work, and I think people sometimes forget that physicality, besides the materiality, is like how much your body is moving to create this work and the labor involved. And so, as someone who studied, the action painters, abstract expressionism, and it was always kind of associated with this masculine things people like Pollock did.
Yes.
Yeah, here's craft tradition, here's contemporary painting. It really is equating, if not surpassing, like it's the same thing. There is so much going in to creating these works.
Yeah, it's true. It is very physical, and sort of demanding. And the other thing is, a lot of people comment that their experience of the work is totally different in photographs and in person. I think when you're standing in front of the work in person, you can gauge the kind of materiality of the work, and also how much went into making it. It has a real physical presence that you just can't tell in photographs or images.
Absolutely, which I think made it all the more challenging, although I was familiar with your work, but just, the reward as a curator for the audience to see it in person, and it's so tempting to touch. We don't touch it, but it's so tempting.
You're all hugging it.
Yes, I know. We have a few more questions. Elise Church asks or says, "Thank you, Meg, for your thorough and thoughtful talk. And I love the relationship of your work to the women in your family history, as well as the history of craft and quilting. Two short questions. Do you use a machine, or are all the works hand sewn? And are you influenced by the painter John Walker, who I'm not familiar with?"
Oh, some of the pieces I do hand sew, which is hilarious because I hate sewing and I'm a terrible sewer. But I've become more interested in hand sewing. But for the really, really big ones, I actually have a friend who has a history in fashion, who has an industrial sewing machine that he threads with upholstery thread so that the pieces cannot burst. So I can give him a drawing for a really big piece, a drawing on canvas, and he will give it back to me sewn. And then from that point, I work on it. Although oftentimes what happens is, once I stuff it, it may not be as exciting as I thought in a drawing, and I may have to cut out a section and then hand sew something on. So it's a little bit of anything goes. And John Walker is a painter who I love, and I actually really wanted to go to Boston University instead of Cornell because he ran the graduate program there. But Cornell University offers you money to go to their graduate program and gives you lots of teaching. And that was an important factor in my decision. So, but yes, I follow John Walker on Instagram.
Wonderful, wonderful insight. That's a new one for me. And there's a question, we'll maybe take two more questions, but there's a question that Malind has, and I've also had regarding slump, and that's the numbers that are depicted, like B9 and B13. So when you're looking at those channels in this large slumping form on the wall, and then you can distinctly make out those numbers. Is that taken from something? What does that allude to?
It is taken from a cardboard model that I made. Something happens, I'm sure, to every artist where your work starts referencing other work that you've made. And that piece references the very first cardboard model that I made, in which I cut out big pieces of cardboard, and they were going to all fit back together again. And so on the back, I labeled them all A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, and then put them together into this massive thing. But then actually I preferred the other side, which had this kind of industrial part-like feeling. And then it seemed important to continue to represent that first iteration of the idea.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I've also been yearning to kind of understand where those came from in those iterations. And I think we'll take our last question before we go to some of our wrap up and thank yous again. And it's from Cami Davis at UVM.
Hi,
And she's and she's a favorite here in Burlington. Meg, loved hearing that you used your children's and your own coats. Do you continue to find clothing as a way to provide fabrics, both practically and also for what they suggest?
I have not continued to do that. And I think about it sometimes. I think about how I could be making grids out of used clothing. And that would also be really responsible of me, because then I would be using something that already had a life. I would be upcycling or recycling. However, I am not doing that anymore. I'm really interested in working on canvas and then having the kind of obvious signifier of canvas being painting, being part of the painting language. But I'm not ruling it out. Maybe I will return to it. That is something that this show has been a wonderful opportunity to see, is that I can see all of these different ideas and how I may want to return to some of them and blow them up or change them or, adjust. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And I know I said that was the last one, but we also have two more guest stars from Mags and Corin. And Mag's comment says, I keep imagining a group of people lifting your slanted grid horizontally from standing in some of the negative spaces and moving it across space. And I can say, Mags, that was about 9 people plus 2 others safely lifting it. And it's one of those beautiful, wonderful anecdotes that we can share as we literally revealed the painting as we hung it on the wall. And from Corin, hello, Corin, a past wonderful BCA artist as well as very well-known international sculptor. Meg, it is so moving to hear and see you think through all of this tremendous work as part of the lineage and history, at least partially, coming out of Vermont artists and artist communities. Just wanted to say thank you, and I love the way you are both working in such an improvisationally embodied and simultaneously historical way.
Oh, that's so nice. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have several others, and I'm sorry, everyone, we can't get to all of those, but it's been really fun kind of looking through these and discussing some of the questions and answers with you. Meg, thank you so much. And if you'll stay with us for a few minutes while I do a few additional thank yous for helping make not only this program, but this exhibition possible for our great art community here today. First, I'd like to thank, as I like to say, the man behind the screen, Colin Storrs, our curatorial assistant and resident Zoom webinar expert, for making this possible, as well as our communications team, John and Ted, for promoting and supporting today's program. You might have heard Meg mention, but we have an amazing exhibition catalog featuring guest essays by Margot Norton, curator at the New Museum, and Chelsea Spengeman, director of the Stan Vanderbeek Archive, as well as all the photos from the show and additional comments that I've written as a curator, and that should be available, fingers crossed, in the galleries on Saturday. And exhibitions such as Meg Lipke's In the Making would not be possible without the financial and in-kind support of our funders. So again, special thanks to Stephanie Spencer and Rolf Kuhlman, as well as our anonymous donors, and for helping make this show possible. And I'd also like to thank Meg's Gallery, Broadway, New York, for working with BCA to present Meg's work here in Vermont. And a special final thanks to Mascoma Bank, our presenters of the 2021 year of exhibitions, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts and the Vermont Arts Council. So In the Making is on view at BCA through May 15th. And there's many options to see this show. You can visit the gallery in person during our normal hours, or you can sign up for our weekly private morning tours, which are beginning Tuesday, April 6th. Please see the website. And you can also virtually visit a 3D version of Meg's show on our BCA home studio page. Thank you again, Meg, for joining us. I can't wait to see you after that second vaccination here in the galleries. And thank you, everyone, for supporting our talk today, and have a wonderful afternoon.